containing an attempt to recover and reconstitute the lost origins of the myths and mysteries, types and symbols, religion and language, with Egypt for the mouthpiece, and Africa as the birthplace.
Welcome back to the deep dive. You know, usually when we approach history, we're a bit like archaeologists. We're carefully dusting off a vase, trying to glue the pieces back together to see, what the original picture was. But today feels a bit different. It feels a lot more like a crime scene investigation.
That's a really good way to put it.
Yeah.
We are, in a sense, looking at a cold case that's about 2,000 years old.
Because we have this massive stack of sources on the table, and I mean, it is a massive stack. We're talking about thousands of pages of 19th century Egyptology, ancient Gnostic texts that were literally buried in a jar in the desert for a millennium.
And some very, very dense modern scholarship trying to piece it all together.
And the picture they're all starting to paint suggests that the history we think we know, well, it might actually be a cover-up.
A cover-up, or maybe a case of mistaken identity on a truly civilizational scale.
The central idea we're tackling today is one of those that just stops you in your tracks. I mean, we're all conditioned to believe that the story of Christianity starts in Judea, right, roughly 2,000 years ago, with a historical figure walking the roads of Galilee.
Right, that's the bedrock assumption.
But the sources we're digging into today, and we have to start with the monumental work of Gerald Massey, they ask a completely different question. What if the story didn't begin in Judea at all?
What if it began thousands of years earlier in the temples and the rituals of ancient Egypt?
And what if, the greatest story ever told is actually just the oldest story ever told, but with the names changed?
With the names anglicized, yeah. That's precisely the question that Massey spent the last 30 years of his life trying to answer.
So let's introduce our main guide for this journey, Gerald Massey. He's not exactly your typical Victorian academic in a tweed jacket, is he?
Oh, not at all. Far from it. Massey was a radical in every sense. He was a poet, a druid, a socialist, and a completely self-taught Egyptologist.
Self-taught. That's key.
It's everything. Because he wasn't part of the university system, he didn't have to play by the accepted theological rules of the 19th century. He could look at the hieroglyphs and just say, wait a minute, this looks exactly like the Gospel of John, without having to worry about his tenure or offending a bishop.
And his work is just immense. We're pulling from this 6-volume collection he wrote.
His magnum opus, yeah. It's a book of the beginnings, then the natural Genesis, and finally ancient Egypt, the light of the world. 6 huge volumes. It's a lifetime of work.
Now, to keep Massey honest, or at least to put him in context, we've got some other material here. We've got the Pistis Sophia,
which is this incredibly strange, incredibly complex Gnostic text. A real trip to read.
We also have the Gnostic Bible. And for some more modern context, Walter Williams is The Historical Origin of Christianity and Martin Bernal's Black Athena.
And we have to talk about Black Athena for a second, because it really explains why most of us have never heard this stuff before.
Okay, what's the argument there?
Bernal basically argues that 19th century European academia became obsessed with the idea of a pure Aryan Greece. They wanted a European civilization that sprang fully formed, from the mind of Europe.
Without any outside influence.
Especially not an African influence. So admitting that the intellectual and spiritual engine of the ancient world was actually African, that was Egyptian, that was just culturally unacceptable back then.
So guys like Massey,
they got pushed to the fringe. They were ignored, not necessarily because they were wrong, but because their conclusions were just too inconvenient for the narrative of the time.
Well, today we are pulling him right back to the center of the table. Our mission for this deep dive is, 1, to trace this Egypto-Gnostic Jesus.
To see where the figure comes from.
2, to figure out what on earth Gnosticism actually is and where it came from. And 3, and this is the part that's probably going to ruffle some feathers, to re-examine the Apostle Paul.
Not as the founder of the church,
but as a Gnostic whose original message was basically hijacked and rewritten.
It's a complete inversion of the standard narrative. It really is.
Okay, so let's start at the very foundation. With Massey's core idea, he talks a lot about what he calls the grammar of myth. He argues that we've lost the ability to read the ancient language of symbolism.
We've become completely literal.
Right. We read a story about a man walking on water, and we think it's a news report. We ask, did it happen or not? But Massey says that's the wrong question. He says it's a type. So what does he mean by typology?
This is the absolute key that unlocks everything in Massey's work. He argues that the ancients, and especially the Egyptians, they did not write history the way we do. They weren't interested in the day-to-day biography of a specific guy named Ramses or Tutankhamun.
They weren't journalists.
No. They were scientists of the soul. They were observing the natural world.
Sure.
They looked at the sun, the moon, the stars, the annual flooding of the Nile. And what they saw were repeating patterns, repeating cycles.
Okay, so they see the sun rise, travel across the sky, set in the west, and then miraculously rise again in the east the next day.
Exactly. Or they see the constellation Orion disappear below the horizon for a period of time and then reappear. Resurrection is written into the very fabric of the cosmos. So to describe these huge abstract concepts like resurrection, light, darkness, salvation, they use symbols taken from nature.
And he calls these zoo types, right?
Oh, types, yes. Animal symbols. It's a brilliant system. If you want to describe the concept of, say, seeing in the dark or guidance through the underworld, what animal do you use?
The jackal.
You use the jackal, Anubis, because that's what the jackal does. It prowls at night. If you want to describe transformation or creation from nothing, you use the scarab beetle, Kepper, because it rolls a ball of dung of death and new life magically emerges from it.
So these weren't just cute cartoons of animal-headed gods. It was a precise symbolic language.
A philosophical grammar. And Massey's whole point is that the life of Jesus in the Gospels is actually a compilation of these ancient Egyptian types. It's describing the journey of the solar god Horus through the 12 houses of the zodiac.
And at the same time,
it's a map of the journey of the human soul through the darkness of ignorance, the underworld, or amenta towards illumination. It's a double allegory.
So when we read about a miracle in the Gospels, Massey is telling us, don't look for a location on a map of Israel.
Look for a location in the sky, or a location inside yourself, in the psyche. The ancients were mapping the cosmos and the human consciousness, not the geography of the Levant.
Let's test this out with some of his specific examples with his vocabulary. Massey loved his philology, comparing words across languages, and one of the biggest ones he tackles is the title Messiah.
Yes, this is a perfect example of his comparative method. We all know that Messiah is the Hebrew word Mashiach, and it means the anointed one.
The one anointed with oil to be king.
That's the standard interpretation. But Massey, as always, digs deeper. He says, where did the Hebrews get this concept? And he traces it back to the Egyptian root word Mesu.
M-E-S-U.
Correct. In the hieroglyphs, Mesu means the child or the son. It was a title for the royal heir. And it was often paired with another word, Iu, which means to come or the coming one.
So Mesu-yu.
Mesu-yu, the coming son or the ever-coming child. In Egyptian theology, the son is born new every single morning. It dies and is reborn. So the child is always coming. It's a perpetual cosmic process.
Okay, I see where this is going. Massey's argument is that the Hebrews took this Egyptian title for a celestial, ever-recurring son.
And they applied it to a human figure. They historicized it. They took this cosmic title and turned it into a political one for a future king who would show up one time and save them.
That is a massive shift in thinking. It moves it from a cosmic constant, the sun is always rising, to a one-time historical event that you have to wait for.
And that, for Massey, is the fundamental error that creates historical Christianity. He has a great phrase for it. He calls it carnalizing the mythos.
Carnalizing the mythos.
Taking a timeless spiritual truth and turning it into a story about flesh and blood history. Once you do that, you lose the original meaning.
Let's try another one, a really big one. In the beginning was the Word, the Logos. That's the opening of John's Gospel. It's always presented as, the height of Greek philosophy.
Right, something that Plato or the Stoics would have come up with.
But Massey says no.
Massey says not so fast. He points to the Egyptian concept of ma-kuru. This is a crucial term. Ma is truth, justice, cosmic order. The goddess Mahat. Keru is the voice or the word.
So ma-kuru is?
The true voice or the word made truth. In the Egyptian myth, the god Horus is the one who speaks the word of power that issues forth from the great silence of the creator god. He is the one who makes the word of his father Osiris true by defeating his enemies. He is the ma-kuru.
It sounds almost like a legal term.
It is, absolutely. When an ancient Egyptian died, their soul had to undergo a trial in the hall of judgment, the weighing of the heart. If you passed that trial, you were declared ma-kuru, justified, vindicated. You now possess the word of power that allowed you to navigate the afterlife.
So when the Gospel of John says, "And the Word was made flesh," a priest in Alexandria would have heard something very different from what we hear.
He would have heard a very old Egyptian formula for the incarnation of the divine spirit into matter and the process of its ultimate vindication. It wasn't new philosophy, it was ancient theology.
Speaking of incarnation, we have to talk about the virgin birth.
Right.
This is, for so many people, the ultimate sticking point. You either have to believe it's a literal biological miracle or you dismiss the whole story as nonsense.
Right, it's presented as an all-or-nothing proposition.
But Massey comes in and says it's neither. He says it's a metaphor that's been tragically misunderstood.
Exactly. And to understand it, he points to the concept he calls the double motherhood. In the Gospels, you have Mary, the Virgin Mother. But she's never alone, is she? There's always the other Mary lurking in the background. Mary of Cleopas, Mary Magdalene. There are always at least two.
Right, at the cross, at the tomb.
Always. In the Egyptian mythos, the god Horus has two mothers, the sisters Isis and Nephis.
Okay.
Isis is the blood mother. She literally conceives and gives birth to Horus. She represents the physical body, the natural birth from matter. But Nephis is the nurse, or the milch mother. She's the one who raises and protects the child. She represents the spiritual nurturing, the second birth.
So the myth is describing the dual nature of humanity.
Precisely. We are all born of matter, from our mother Isis. That's our physical birth. But to achieve enlightenment, we must be born again of the spirit, nurtured by our spiritual mother Nephis. The two Marys of the Gospels are just playing the roles of the two Egyptian goddesses.
So the virgin aspect isn't about biology at all.
Not in the slightest. The Egyptian goddess Neith, for example, was known as the ever-virgin. Didn't mean she was chaste. It meant she was primordial, a primary source. She could reproduce without a male consort. It's a metaphysical statement about the divine source of life.
Spirit enters matter from a source that is pure, uncorrupted by any lower principle.
That's the Gnostic idea in a nutshell.
Mm-hmm.
But when you historicize that profound metaphysical concept, you end up with a biological impossibility that people have been fighting wars over for 2,000 years.
I want to zoom in on the timeline of Jesus' life for a moment, because this was one of those real aha moments for me when I was reading Massey. We have Jesus at age 12 in the temple, confounding the elders.
Right.
And then just radio silence. Nothing.
Okay.
A huge gap until he's 30 years old. Then he gets baptized by John and begins his ministry. Why that specific gap? Why 12 and why 30?
If you're looking at it as a historical biography, it's a baffling hole in the story. Where did he go? What did he do? People have invented stories about him going to India or Britain.
Right, the lost years.
But if you look at it through the lens of the Egyptian mythos, it's a perfect fit. It's not a hole at all. Massey explains that there are two primary forms of Horus. First, there's Horus the child, or Harpocrute, who the Greeks called Harpocrates.
Okay.
He's often depicted as a young boy around 12 years old with his finger to his lips. He is the Word, just beginning to speak, but not yet fully manifest. Him being in the temple at age 12 is the mythic type of the child god coming into his father's house.
And then he transforms.
He transforms. At age 30, he becomes Horus the adult, the vindicator, the avenger of his father, Osiris. Now, 30 was the age of priesthood in many traditions, yes, but for the Egyptians, the number was primarily astronomical. It has to do with the 30-year cycle of the planet Saturn and the mastery of time. The missing years aren't missing from the story.
They just aren't part of the mythic structure that's being told.
Exactly. The story is only interested in two phases, the child phase at 12 and the adult phase at 30. Everything in between is irrelevant to the allegory.
And what about the 12 disciples? Are they also part of this astronomical code?
Oh, absolutely. Massey's term for them is incredible. He calls them the rowers of the solar bark.
Okay, that sounds way cooler than fishermen from Galilee.
It really does, doesn't it? The images of the sun god, Ra or Horus, traveling across the sky, the celestial ocean, in a great boat. But he doesn't row himself. Who powers the boat?
The 12.
The 12 powers of the zodiac, the 12 constellations. In the Gnostic systems, they were called the 12 eons. As the sun moves through the sky during the year, it metaphorically calls each of these powers to serve it, to row its boat.
So Jesus walking along the shore of Galilee and saying, "Follow me," to Peter and Andrew,
Is a dramatization of the sun god, entering the new sign of the zodiac and gathering its powers. Massey calls them the Kamite originals. Kamite meaning from Kenmet, which is the ancient name for Egypt. The 12 fishermen are the Kamite originals of the 12 zodiacal rowers.
This is a perfect bridge into our next section because this is where Massey really drops the hammer. the Egypto-Gnostic Jesus. We've talked about the title Mesu, but there's another word, another etymology, that Massey claims is the absolute smoking gun. The word is charast.
This is probably his most famous and certainly his most controversial linguistic connection. We all use the word Christ. We're told it comes from the Greek Christos, which means anointed.
The anointed one.
Right. But Massey asks the obvious next question. Anointed for what? And where did this whole concept of a dead and risen God who was anointed come from in the first place? He points directly to the Egyptian word charast.
Can you spell that for us?
K-R-S-T. In the Egyptian language, the charast is the mummy.
The mummy.
But it's not just a dead body wrapped in cloth. It's a technical term. The charast is the body that has been ritually embalmed, purified, anointed with sacred oils, and then wrapped in the seamless linen bandage. It's a body that has been prepared for resurrection.
Anointed with oils.
The anointing was essential. The sacred oil was sometimes called the kris or kris. The act of anointing the body is what transformed it from a corpse into a charast. It was a magical act to preserve it, to prepare it to become a vessel for the returning spirit.
So in Egyptian theology, you don't rise from the dead unless you are first charasated.
You cannot.
Yeah.
You have to undergo the process of the charast to become a sahu, a glorified spiritual body that can live forever. The mummy was the necessary chrysalis for the spiritual butterfly to emerge.
So when Massey says Christ, he basically means the mummified one.
In the deep esoteric sense, yes. The anointed one is the one who has been ritually prepared for immortality through this process. Massey's radical claim is that the entire story of Jesus' passion, death, burial, and resurrection is a dramatization of the mystery of the mummy from the Egyptian Book of the Dead.
It gives a very, very different vibe to the phrase Christ has risen.
It becomes the mummy has risen. And the parallels, when you start looking for them, get incredibly specific and, frankly, a little spooky. Let's take the story of Lazarus.
Okay, this is the big one. Jesus' greatest miracle, raising a man from the dead.
Right, John's Gospel. Jesus gets to the tomb and cries out, "Lazarus, come forth." First, just look at the name itself. In Egyptian, the great god of the dead, the one who is resurrected, is Osiris.
Of course.
He's often addressed with the title Azar. Now, in Semitic languages like Hebrew or Arabic, you often add the definite article al or el to the beginning of a name. So Al-Asar or El-Osiris.
Belisar, Lazarus.
Exactly. The name Lazarus is almost certainly a Hellenized version of El-Osiris, the Osiris. The story isn't about a man named Lazarus, it's about the raising of the Osiris.
Wow, okay. That's a pretty direct link.
But it gets better. Look at the details in the story. John makes a very specific point of saying that Lazarus has been in the tomb for 4 days, and Martha, his sister, says, "Lord, by this time he stinketh." It's a very visceral, almost unpleasant detail.
I always just assumed that was to prove he was really, truly dead, not just in a coma.
That's the historicist reading, the literal reading. But in the ancient Osirian mysteries, the period of mourning for the dead god Osiris by the goddesses Isis and Nephthys lasted for exactly 4 days. It was the specific, ritually mandated interval between death and the beginning of the rites of resurrection.
So the 4 days isn't a historical detail, it's a ritual number.
It's a ritual number. And what about the stinketh part? In the Egyptian Book of the Dead, there are lines where the Horus figure addresses the deceased, the Osiris, and says, "I am the herald of his father to him whose throat stinketh." It's a ritual line acknowledging the physical corruption of the grave, which is about to be overcome by the magic of resurrection.
So you're saying the writer of John's Gospel isn't reporting a news event from a village called Bethany?
Massey's contention is that they are writing out a script. They are taking a chapter from the Egyptian Book of the Dead and transposing the ritual into a historical narrative.
That's incredible. What about the other miracles? What about healing the blind? That's a constant theme.
A huge theme. A nice humanitarian act, right?
Yeah.
A compassionate teacher healing the sick. But again, Massey links this directly to the Egyptian underworld, the Amenta. In the text describing the soul's journey after death, there's a specific region called the City of the Blind.
A city of the blind.
Yes, it's a realm of darkness where the souls of the dead are stumbling around in spiritual ignorance, unable to see the light. And who enters this city to save them? Horus, bearing the title Light of the World.
A title Jesus also uses for himself, constantly.
It's one of his primary titles. So Horus enters the city of the blind to open their eyes. The miracle isn't about physical optometry, it's an allegory for spiritual illumination. But when you carnalize that myth, you get a story about a guy literally putting mud and spit on people's eyes.
You lose the whole symbolic depth. And then there's Mary Magdalene. She has 7 devils cast out of her. What's the Egyptian root of that?
This one goes way, way back. Before the rise of the great solar cults of Ra and Horus, Egypt was dominated by older lunar and stellar cults. And in those systems, the Great Mother was the supreme deity.
The goddess.
The goddess. And she was often associated with 7 primary elemental powers. Things like storms, darkness, chaos, fate. These were often symbolized as 7 serpents, or in one famous myth, 7 scorpions that served the goddess Isis.
So when the solar cult comes along,
The new solar god has to prove his dominance. He has to tame these older, more chaotic feminine powers. He has to subdue the 7. So the story of Jesus casting the 7 devils out of Mary Magdalene is a late retelling of the much older myth of the solar god Horus, taming the 7 elemental powers of the primordial mother goddess.
so it's a story about a shift in religious epochs from a mother-centric cult to a sun-centric one.
That's what Massey argues. It's fascinating because it implies that these characters in the Bible, Mary, Peter, Lazarus, John the Baptist, they might not be people at all. They are personifications of ancient theological concepts and cosmic powers.
You're actors wearing masks in a cosmic play.
Exactly. And speaking of plays, look at the scene at the tomb. After Jesus dies and is buried, the Gospels say the women sat and watched the tomb.
Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. There's that pair again.
The pair again. Now, if you look at any piece of Egyptian funerary art, any sarcophagus, you will always see the 2 divine sisters, Isis and Nephthys, kneeling and watching over the mummy of their brother, Osiris. One is always depicted at the head of the mummy, and one is at the feet. They are called the Myrnae,
The Myrte.
which means the 2 watchers, or the 2 eyes. Massey's claim is that the gospel scene of the 2 Marys watching the tomb is a direct, literal, visual description of this ubiquitous Egyptian religious vignette.
Wow. I want to throw one more name into this section before we move on to Gnosticism because it seems important. The figure of Imhotep.
Ah, yes. Most people might know him by his Greek name, Imhotep, the brilliant architect who built the first step pyramid for King Djoser.
Right, a real historical person.
He was. But centuries after his death, he was deified. He was elevated to the status of a god, a son of the creator god Ptah.
And his Egyptian name, what does it mean?
Imhotep means he who comes with peace.
He who comes with peace. I feel like I've heard that somewhere before.
He is literally the Prince of Peace. He was the god of healing and wisdom. And significantly, he was a bringer of plenty of food and water. He was often depicted as a simple, peaceful youth. Massey argues that Imhotep is a major Egyptian prototype for the gentle, peaceful, healing aspect of the Jesus character.
So we have the name, the titles, the miracles, the timeline, the resurrection, the virgin birth. Massey is building a really powerful wall of evidence here, but it all begs the huge question, how? How did this happen? How do we get from a temple in Memphis to a church in Rome? How does the myth become the history?
And that question leads us directly to Section 3, the origins and development of Gnosticism.
This is the bridge. This is the missing link.
It's the only way to understand the connection. If you don't understand Gnosticism, you can't see the transmission mechanism.
Now, the way we usually hear about Gnosticism is that it was this weird fringe heresy that popped up after Christianity was already established, kind of like a bizarre mutation.
That's certainly the story that the early church fathers, like Irenaeus and Tertullian, wanted us all to believe. They painted it as a corruption of the pure original faith.
But Massey and a lot of modern scholars now, they argue the exact opposite.
The complete opposite. That Gnosticism, in its earliest forms, was the root of what became Christianity. And to understand its origin, we have to travel to one specific city, Alexandria.
Alexandria in Egypt, the great melting pot of the ancient world.
You have to imagine this city. It's the intellectual capital of the planet. You have the ancient Egyptian priests with their thousands of years of temple allegories and rituals. You have the greatest Greek philosophers, the Platonists and the Stoics. And you have a huge, thriving community of Jewish scholars who are reinterpreting their scriptures using Greek philosophical methods.
And they're all living together, arguing, trading ideas.
In the great library, in the markets, in the schools, this incredible intellectual crucible is what produced Gnosticism. It was synthesis.
So what is the absolute core of Gnosticism? What's the main idea?
The main idea is right there in the name. Gnosis. It's a Greek word that means knowledge.
But not just book learning, right?
Not at all. Not intellectual knowledge. It means direct, personal, experiential knowledge of the divine. The Gnostics understood that the holy texts, whether Egyptian or Jewish, were allegories about the journey of the soul. They were not history lessons. They were maps.
Let's break down their cosmology, their map of the universe, because it sounds like something out of a wild science fiction novel. They start with the pleroma.
The pleroma, another Greek word, means the fullness. It's the ultimate reality, the true Godhead. It's a realm of pure light and spirit. And Massey immediately traces this concept back to the Egyptian Pult, which means the company of the gods, the 9 original emanations from the creator god Adam.
And inside this pleroma, you have these beings called eons.
Eons. They are emanations or divine powers or aspects of the Godhead. They exist in male-female pairs called syzygies.
And then in the classic Gnostic story, something goes terribly wrong.
Sophia. Her name means wisdom. She is one of the youngest and most ambitious of the eons, and she makes a catastrophic mistake. She tries to comprehend the unknowable Father, the source of all, but she does it without her male counterpart. She acts alone.
And in doing so, she falls.
She falls from the pleroma, and in her passion and confusion, she gives birth to an accidental, deformed offspring, a monster. This is the demiurge.
The demiurge, the craftsman.
Aldabaoth is one of his names. He is a blind, ignorant, and arrogant god. He looks around and sees nothing but the darkness he has created, and he declares, "I am God, and there is no other God but me."
The God of the Old Testament for many Gnostics.
For many Gnostics, yes.
Yeah.
And this demiurge, this blind craftsman, he creates the material world, our world, as a flawed, clumsy copy of the spiritual pleroma above. And he traps the divine sparks, which are fragments of his mother Sophia's light, inside his counterfeit creation.
Inside human bodies.
Inside matter. So our spirits are these divine sparks from the world of light, imprisoned in bodies of clay made by a lesser, ignorant god.
This sounds remarkably similar to the Egyptian myths about the soul, the Ba, being trapped in the mummy or in the underworld.
It's the same fundamental structure. It's Isis searching for the scattered pieces of the divine Osiris. It's the fall of the soul into matter. And so the ultimate goal of the Gnostic is to escape this material prison and return home to the pleroma.
And to do that, you need the map. You need the escape plan.
You need the Gnosis, the knowledge.
Yeah.
And this is where a text like the Pistis Sophia becomes so important. It's not a theological treatise. It reads like a video game walkthrough.
Literally, you have to pass through different levels, different worlds.
You do. After death, the soul has to ascend through the spheres of the planets, which Gnostics saw as the realms of the demiurge's servants, the archons or rulers. They called them the 12 dungeons. And at each gate or dungeon, there's a guardian.
And these guardians are often described with animal faces.
Yes, often with the face of a lion or a crocodile or a serpent or a dog.
That is straight out of the Egyptian Book of the Dead. I mean, 100%.
It's identical. In the Book of the Dead, the soul of the deceased has to pass through a series of gates or pylons in the underworld. And at each pylon, a terrifying monster stops them. And to get past, you have to speak a password. You have to say, "I know you, I know your name, stand aside." You have to possess the makero, the word of power.
So the Gnostics just took this ancient Egyptian ritual journey of the soul and Hellenized it, gave it Greek names.
That's the argument. The structure is exactly the same.
So salvation in this system has nothing to do with believing that a guy died for your sins 2,000 years ago.
Nothing. It's about knowing the passwords. It's about having the gnosis that allows you to bypass the cosmic jailers.
And the ultimate goal is to receive the vesture of light. What is that?
The vesture of light is the Gnostic term for the glorified spiritual body that the soul puts on after it is purified and has shed its material and psychic bodies. It's the radiant garment that makes you invisible to the archons.
Which perfectly parallels the Egyptian Sahu, the shining, incorruptible spiritual body of the resurrected Osiris.
It's the same concept with a different name.
Okay, this is a radical shift in understanding. The Christ in this Gnostic system isn't a historical person. The Christ is the revealer of the Gnosis. He's the one who brings the map, the passwords. He's the principle of salvation itself.
Exactly. The Christ is a spiritual office, a principle of light, not a man from Nazareth.
So if Gnosticism was this original root, this powerful synthesis of Egyptian and Greek thought, how did we end up with the historical story we have now? Who was the agent of that transformation?
Well, this brings us to the fourth and perhaps most explosive section of our deep dive. It brings us to the most enigmatic and fought-over figure in the entire New Testament.
The Apostle Paul.
Paul. Or as the early church father Tertullian, in a moment of frustration, called him the Apostle of the Heretics.
Wait, I have to stop you there. An Orthodox church father like Tertullian called Paul, the Apostle Paul, a heretic.
He called him the Apostle of the Heretics because the Gnostic groups, the ones Tertullian was fighting against, all loved Paul. They all claimed him as their primary teacher, their greatest champion.
They saw him as one of them.
They insisted he was one of them. And Massey takes this historical clue and runs with it. His argument is simple and devastating. Paul was a Gnostic. The original Paul was a Gnostic teacher.
But hold on, Paul talks about Jesus Christ all the time. His letters are full of him.
Is he talking about a man, though? I mean, really look closely at his letters. The ones that scholars agree are genuinely his: Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, a few others. Paul almost never quotes a single teaching of Jesus from the Gospels.
That's true. You don't get the Sermon on the Mount from Paul.
You don't get the parables. He doesn't mention the virgin birth. He doesn't talk about the miracles of healing the blind or feeding the 5,000. He shows almost zero interest in the earthly life or ministry of a historical Jesus of Nazareth.
He's mostly focused on theology, on the meaning of the cross and the resurrection.
He's focused on a mystery, a mysterion. He uses that word over and over. In Galatians, he says it as explicitly as possible. I certify you, brethren, that the gospel which was preached of me is not after man. For I neither received it of man, neither was I taught it, but by the revelation of Jesus Christ.
Not from man. So he's saying, I didn't get this from Peter or James or any of the guys in Jerusalem who supposedly knew Jesus. I didn't read it in a book. I got it directly from a vision.
A vision, a gnosis, an internal mystical experience. Massey argues that Paul's Christ is the cosmic Christ, the Gnostic Christ within. In Colossians, he calls Christ the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of every creature. By him, all things were created.
That's not Carpenter from a small town in Galilee.
No, that is the Logos. That is the primary eon from the Pleroma. That's a Gnostic cosmological being, not a historical person.
And this Gnostic reading of Paul, it suddenly explains the feud, doesn't it? Because in the Bible, it's clear that Paul is constantly fighting with the Jerusalem apostles, with Peter and James.
It is a vicious, vicious conflict. We tend to paper over it, but it's right there in the text. In Galatians, Paul calls them false brethren who came in to spy out our liberty. He mocks them, saying they seem to be pillars, but that they added nothing to me.
And the big showdown in Antioch.
The Antioch incident where he says, I withstood Peter to his face because he was to be blamed. Now, the traditional explanation for this is that it was a minor squabble about whether Gentile converts had to be circumcised or not.
Right, a debate about following the Jewish law.
But Massey and others see it as something much deeper. A fundamental clash of worldviews, a war between two different kinds of Christianity.
Esoteric versus exoteric.
Exactly. It's Paul's Gnostic, universal spiritual Christianity versus the Judaic flesh and blood law-based version represented by James and the Jerusalem church. Paul is trying to break free from the historic or fleshly version of the faith to preach the purely spiritual, internal Christ. It's right there in his most famous line. The letter kills, but the spirit gives life. That is the Gnostic motto.
Okay, but here's the problem, and it's a big one. If Paul was a Gnostic who didn't believe in a historical Jesus, why do his letters sometimes sound, well, orthodox? Why are there verses that seem to support the historical view?
And that is the absolute core of the mystery. This is where the interpolation theory comes in. This is the crime scene.
The idea that the texts were altered.
Yes. We have to remember a crucial fact. We do not possess a single original letter that Paul wrote with his own hand. Not one. What we have are copies of copies of copies, all of which were preserved and edited by the very Orthodox Church that was fighting against Gnosticism.
So Massey's argument is that Paul's letters were patched.
Patched, edited, forged, carnalized, to use his term. Let's look at a prime example. Romans chapter 1, verse 3. It says that Jesus Christ was made of the seed of David according to the flesh.
That sounds pretty historical. A clear bloodline.
It does. But Massey argues it's a glaring contradiction to everything else Paul says about a pre-existent, cosmic, spiritual Christ. He believes this verse was inserted into the letter by a later editor to tie the Gnostic Christ down to a specific Jewish bloodline to make him historical.
To make him fit the agenda of the Jerusalem church.
Precisely. And what about the most famous example? 1 Corinthians chapter 15. The list of witnesses to the resurrection. He was seen of Cephas, then of the 12. After that, he was seen of above 500 brethren at once.
This is the bedrock of the historical resurrection argument. Eyewitness testimony.
It is. But it's also the biggest red flag in the entire Pauline corpus, because you have this list of supposed eyewitnesses presented like evidence and a court case proof of a physical historical resurrection. But then just a few verses later, in the same chapter, Paul launches into this beautiful, mystical, purely Gnostic explanation of the resurrection.
Flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God.
Behold, I show you a mystery. We shall all be changed. For this corruptible must put on incorruption. He's describing a transformation into a spiritual body, not the reanimation of a physical corpse. The argument is that the two sections don't fit. The witness list, the historic proof, was pasted onto the beginning of an older Gnostic text about spiritual ascent and transformation.
It's like someone taped a newspaper clipping onto the first page of a poem. The tone, the message, it's completely different.
It's a clumsy edit. And then, of course, you have the pastoral epistles 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus. Most mainstream critical biblical scholars today, even conservative ones, agree that Paul did not write these letters.
So they're fakes.
The scholarly term is pseudepigrapha. They were written in Paul's name probably decades after his death. And what is the primary purpose of a letter like 1 Timothy?
To set up a church hierarchy. Bishops, deacons, elders.
Exactly. To enforce order and authority. And in chapter 6, to explicitly command his followers to avoid profane and vain babblings and oppositions of science, falsely so called. And the Greek word that's translated there as science.
Let me guess. Gnosis.
It's Gnosis. Avoid the oppositions of Gnosis, falsely so called. Someone wrote a fake letter from Paul to attack the very Gnosticism that the real Paul seems to have preached.
That is unbelievably Machiavellian. It's a hostile takeover of his legacy.
It was a battle for the soul of the religion. They couldn't just delete Paul from history. He was too famous. His letters were too widespread. So they did the next best thing. They domesticated him. They edited his authentic letters and then wrote new fraudulent ones in his name to make him sound like an Orthodox bishop.
Wow. It all comes down to power, doesn't it?
It always does. The historic church needed a source of authority. If salvation is internal, if it's based on your own personal gnosis, you don't need a bishop. You don't need a pope. You don't need a priest. You just need the knowledge.
But if salvation depends on believing in a unique historical event that happened to a specific group of men, the apostles,
then you need the church, because the church claims to be the sole inheritor of their authority. They hold the keys. So historicizing the myth wasn't just a theological mistake. It was a brilliant political strategy to consolidate power.
we have to bring in one more crucial figure here to understand this transition period, a man named Marcion.
Marcion of Sinope. He is the pivot point. We're in the mid-2nd century now, around 140 AD, and Marcion is arguably the first person to ever try and create a New Testament. He collected Paul's letters and paired them with a single gospel.
But Marcion was considered the arch-heretic by the Orthodox Church.
The worst of the worst. And why? Because he was a radical dualist. He took one look at the Hebrew Bible and said, the God described in these pages cannot be the Father of Jesus Christ.
Why not?
He is the God of the Old Testament, the creator. The demiurge, as the Gnostics would call him, was a God of strict law, of justice, of jealousy, and of war, a lesser God. But Jesus, Marcion said, came to reveal a completely different God, a God no one had ever known before, the alien God.
The alien God.
Or the stranger God, a God who existed outside of the created system, a God of pure love and mercy, who had nothing to do with creation. And this alien God sent Jesus to save us from the flawed world created by the demiurge.
So Marcion's Bible, it didn't have an Old Testament at all.
He rejected it completely. And his gospel was a version of the Gospel of Luke. But, and this is the absolutely crucial part, Marcion's Gospel of Luke did not have the first 2 chapters.
No birth stories.
No manger, no shepherds, no angels, no genealogy, tracing Jesus back to King David. In Marcion's Gospel, Jesus just appears out of nowhere, descending from heaven into the synagogue at Capernaum as a fully grown man, a divine phantom.
Now, the story from the Church Fathers is that Marcion took the real Gospel of Luke and literally took a razor blade to it, cutting out the parts he didn't like.
That's the official story. But Massey, and many critical scholars after him, ask a terrifyingly simple question. What if Marcion had the original version? What if the birth stories, the historicizing elements that tie Jesus to the house of David and the prophecies of the Old Testament, what if those were added later by the Orthodox Church specifically to combat Marcion's purely Gnostic, ahistorical Jesus?
That flips the whole script on its head. Marcion is no longer the heretic corrupting the text.
He becomes the conservative, trying to preserve the original Gnostic teaching against a later historicizing revision.
Okay, let's try and synthesize all of this. We have a clear transmission chain taking shape here. It starts with the ancient Egyptian mythic grammar, the types, the charast, the mesu.
Then that grammar moves into the great intellectual blender of Alexandria, where it's synthesized with Greek philosophy and Jewish scripture to create the Gnostic wisdom tradition.
From there, it's transmitted through figures like the Apostle Paul, who preaches the Gnostic gospel of the Christ within.
And finally, that Gnostic message is captured, edited, and ultimately overwritten by the Proto-Orthodox movement, which historicizes the entire mythos in order to create a new religion based on historical claims and institutional authority.
Now, we have to be critical here for a moment. Massey was writing this in the late 1800s, using the tools available to him then. His work isn't perfect, is it?
No, absolutely not. We have to be honest about that. Massey was what you might call a pan-Egyptianist. He saw Egypt everywhere. Some of his linguistic connections are, let's say, very enthusiastic. Modern mainstream Egyptologists would certainly quibble with or outright reject some of his specific etymologies. He's reconstructing a huge amount from fragmentary evidence.
But on the other hand, since his time, we've found things he could only have dreamed of. We found the Nag Hammadi library.
And this is his ultimate vindication in many ways. In 1945, this jar full of lost Gnostic Gospels was discovered in the Egyptian desert. Massey never saw these texts, and yet when you read them, texts like the Apocalypse of Paul or the Second Treatise of the Great Seth, they confirm his core intuition over and over again.
How so?
They speak of a laughing Jesus on the cross, a spiritual being who could not be harmed, who mocked the archons, the rulers of this world, who thought they could kill him. They confirm beyond any doubt that many early Christians had a wildly different, non-historical, purely Gnostic understanding of who and what Christ was.
And a book like Martin Bernal's Black Athena, while controversial in its own right, at least supports the broad stroke of the argument that Egypt was a foundational mother of Western civilization, not some distant, exotic cousin.
Correct. The idea of Jerusalem and Athens emerging in some kind of cultural vacuum independent of the Nile Valley is just not tenable anymore. Egypt fed them both, intellectually and spiritually.
Okay, so where does this leave us? The listeners driving home right now trying to process all of this. If the history is a myth, does the whole story lose its value? Does it all just fall apart?
That is the ultimate question, isn't it? If you strip away the historical carpenter from Nazareth, do you lose the entire religion? And Massey's answer would be an emphatic no. You don't lose the religion, you lose the illusion. And by losing the illusion, you gain the truth.
Because the history is just the outer shell, the exoteric wrapping for the inner esoteric meaning.
Think of it this way. If it's history, it's just an anecdote. It's something that happened to one specific guy, one time, 2,000 years ago. It's fundamentally external to you. It's something you have to believe in based on faith in ancient documents.
But if it's mythos, if it's Gnosis,
then it becomes a timeless, universal spiritual map. It's not about a Christ who rose from a tomb in Jerusalem 2 millennia ago. It's about the Christ principle, the divine spark that can rise from the tomb of your own consciousness, right here, right now.
So the Christ is not a man you worship, but a potential you realize within yourself.
Truth crushed to earth shall rise again. That was one of Massey's favorite mottos. He believed the Egyptian roots of our spiritual traditions had been deliberately buried under centuries of dogmatic literal history. But they're rising again. The Christ is slowly, finally, unwrapping his bandages.
That's a very powerful image, the resurrection of the idea of resurrection itself.
And Massey really leaves us with this one final provocative thought. He says that the historic Christianity has been a long delusion, a profound misunderstanding of the ancient symbols. But the mythos, the Gnosis, offers a path to genuine spiritual awakening. And so the final question is for you, the listener.
Are you looking for a savior outside of yourself in a history book? Or are you willing to do the hard work of looking into your own amenta, your own underworld, your own subconscious, and finding the divine light that's been buried there all along?
Is the Christ a man who died on a cross 2,000 years ago? Or is it the principle of eternal light waiting to rise within you?
That is a deep dive if I have ever heard one.
It changes everything.
It certainly does. Thank you for taking this incredible journey with us. It's a lot to unpack, but hey, that's what we're here for. Thanks for taking the deep dive.
Until next time.
Containing an attempt to recover and reconstitute the lost origins of the myths and mysteries, types and symbols, religion and language, with Egypt for the mouthpiece and Africa as the birthplace.